Immanuel Kant is arguably the most important figure in the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And as Professor Staloff just showed you, his treatment of epistemological and ontological problems is profound and synthesizes many trends that have been present in the history of continental rationalism and also in British empiricism. And the remainder of his philosophy, the moral philosophy and the political philosophy, also deals with themes that had been developed in the previous history of moral thought. Particularly, Kant's moral philosophy is a reaction to the kind of skeptical, reductive, naturalistic approach to philosophy, to morals, to politics that was characteristic of David Hume. In Professor Staloff's lecture yesterday on Humean morals, I believe you found out that Hume held the view that morally praiseworthy actions were actions which were agreeable to ourselves or to others, or useful to ourselves or to others. Now, there's all kinds of difficulties attached to this sort of a view. On one level, it's immediately kind of attractive because it's commonsensical. It's more or less consistent with our experience of the world. But there is a deep problem in it, because to some extent, it tends to subjectivize ethics. It makes ethics a question of opinion, or taste, or sentiment, because ultimately the foundation of our moral judgments, in Hume's view, is our feelings of approbation that come from the utility or pleasure we derive from the behavior of ourselves or other people. This bothered Immanuel Kant enormously. Kant wrote that it was David Hume who roused him out of his dogmatic slumbers, who made him really understand the strength and the profundity of English empiricism and the skeptical approach to morals and to politics that's characteristic of it. Kant was a very religious thinker. It's hard to immediately discern when you read his work because it's so dry and technical and sophisticated in terms of its logical proceedings. But Kant came from a pietist family, a family of German Protestants who were extremely devoted to religion and to religious values. Kant is a strong religious believer, in contrast to Hume. Kant is a very pious, almost solemn thinker. And when he saw Hume's moral theory, at first he tried to refute it and was unable to. And he spent 11 years reading Hume, trying to work through it. One only engages in an 11-year reading project of the same philosopher if he bothers you a great deal. And Kant was most upset about the implications in Hume, which were essentially that morals are a question of taste, a question of feeling, a question of sentiment. Now, it's a simple empirical fact that people's feelings or sentiments are different. You go from one person to another, and if you ask them what their favorite color is, or what their favorite food is, or what their favorite piece of music is, you will find that these opinions vary from person to person. And this bothered Kant enormously. It seems to imply that God's justice, that the ultimate divine moral law, is an illusion or a myth, doesn't apply to human beings. Hume suggests to us that morality is really a branch of anthropology. And this bothered Kant tremendously. He said, I cannot stand to see morals brought to the level of a wretched anthropology. So we're going to get beyond wretched anthropology here to a universal system of moral judgment, which is completely binding on all rational beings under all circumstances. That's the sort of religious truth that Kant wants to formulate in the language of German idealism. Let me cut to the conclusion early on so you understand what the gist of Kant is. He is trying to create a rapprochement between Christian religious belief and the intellectual state of Western culture once it had developed Newtonian mechanics and its social and political and moral concomitants. So Kant is trying to reconcile his faith in the God of the Bible, his belief in heaven, in ultimate moral justice, and he's trying to do it in an intellectually serious and sophisticated way, one that doesn't pound on the desk and demand the abdication of your rationality, but rather is the high point and perfection of rationality. So it's an enormously ambitious task that Kant undertakes. Now, in a book called The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, which I think you ought to read if you're interested in finding out about Kantian morality, it's the most accessible of Kant's books, which is not saying a great deal. Right? Those of you who have read Kant before can understand how forbidding his prose is. One of the problems with German philosophy as a whole is that there's not much in the way of clarity or elegance of style. The easy and directly accessible philosophers tend to write in English, for better or worse. The more difficult philosophy, like that of Kant, you find among the German-speaking authors. Now, Kant's book, The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, states that Kant wishes to become the Newton of the moral world. Again, I've come back again and again to the theme of physical science, the breakthrough of Newtonian mechanics, which has fundamental implications for the rest of our thinking about politics, about society, about right and wrong, and about the individual psyche. So Kant wants to be the Newton of the moral world. A couple of things are built into that idea, that aspiration. First, that there's a difference between the moral world and the everyday world of sense perception, the Newtonian world. And in fact, this is the case. Kant is a metaphysical thinker. What I mean by a metaphysical thinker is a thinker that splits the cosmos, splits the world into two parts. This is somewhat analogous to the distinction Plato makes in the divided line between the world of sense and the world of the form, some world outside of space and time. Kant believes that there's some similar distinction in ontology. There's a noumenal world and a phenomenal world. The noumenal world is the world of sense perception. The phenomenal world is the world of sense perception, the world of space and time, the world which is accounted for by Newtonian mechanics and which is completely connected by the principle of causality. One thing causes another. There's a completely determinate relationship between all events in the physical world of space and time. This is Newton's great achievement, to show us that F equals ma for all bodies everywhere, or at least that's what was thought at the end of the 18th century. Now, by splitting the world and giving, if not the devil his due, giving the physicists their due, by allowing Newton to run the world of space and time, he has a separate realm in which he hopes to do something analogous to what Isaac Newton did, to formulate the rules of the noumenal world, of the moral world, the ultimate quasi-mathematical algorithm of moral justice, of moral righteousness, which applies to things that are noumenal, to human souls, to rational agents, to free entities. So there's a distinction between the two halves of the world. The Newtonian world is the world of space and time, the world of causality. Each domino knocks down the other domino. In the other world, the noumenal world, that's the realm of freedom, that's the realm of morality. So there's a split in the world between the world of causality and the world of freedom. And by rescuing the idea of freedom, by allowing it to be intellectually serious, by giving it a place in his ontology, he has made possible the autonomous judgment of free moral acts. In other words, if the Newtonians and the Humeans are right, and the world is simply the set of space-time events, there is no freedom. Freedom is an impossibility. If Isaac Newton is right, and that each event in the world causes the next event that comes after it, well then, first of all, what does it mean to praise or blame someone for what they did? They're as determined, they're as mechanical as anything else in an entirely mechanical Newtonian universe. Human beings are essentially elaborate, soft machines. They're internal clockworks that do what they do because they have to, since that's the nature of the universe as a whole once we adopt Newtonian mechanics as an architectonic perspective on the world. This is what bothers Kant. He says, if we live in an entirely determined world of bodies and moving through space, well then, what does it mean to say that this is a good action or that's a bad action? It simply says that I like this action or that I don't like that action. It relativizes moral judgment. It subjectivizes moral judgment. It essentially says that there are no moral facts, that there are only moral opinions, and that the aggregate, the rough generalizations about most moral opinions are what we call good and evil. Since these judgments, these aggregate judgments of good and evil, change across geography, perhaps people's moral judgments in China are different from the ones made in England. Perhaps the ones made in England at the time of Roman conquest were different from the ones made in the 18th century. What it does is relativize and subjectivize ethics, turn moral judgment into what Kant called a wretched anthropology. Well, Kant proposes to offer a universal law that allows us to establish the good or evil of every action by every free, rational, moral agent under all circumstances, independent of space and time. This universal moral algorithm will be true in China and true in England. True on the North Pole, true at the equator. True today, true tomorrow, was true last year, true 1,000 years ago, it's true forever. In other words, Kant wants to wrap up moral truth in an armor of idealism and logic, and present it to a way that he believes unassailable to anyone who really understands his argument. Kant is going to formulate the law of ultimate moral duty, and this is called the categorical imperative. Kant says in the beginning of the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals that the only good thing is a good will. And that's a profound and important and essentially Christian idea. It's something that essentially comes in, certainly with St. Augustine. The intention of your action is the standard by which we're going to judge it. Now, here's an important departure from Hume. Those of you who have read Hume's treatise, those of you who have read Hume's Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, will find that he doesn't talk a great deal about intention. As a matter of fact, intention isn't a great concern to Hume. The internal operations of people's psyches, that's not the problem. If you want to know whether an action is good or evil, you don't go back to the intention of the agent, although that may be kind of interesting in influencing your feelings about their action. But the key thing for Hume in judging an agent's good or evil behavior is how you feel about the consequences of what they did. So it's your feeling for Hume. In Kant's case, it's not a question of feeling, it's a question of finding out what the agent intended. If they intended something good, if they had no malice, a forethought, then their behavior is blameless. On the other hand, if they did have malice or a bad intent when they began an action, even if they didn't carry the action out, it's an evil thing. Let me give you an example to make this clear, because it's not always immediately obvious. Imagine a workman working on the roof of a building. He's standing up there, and he notices a loose brick. He sees somebody on the ground, says, I don't like that guy, I've always hated that guy. He throws the brick down and kills him. Now, Hume would say we don't like that because it makes us feel bad for the poor guy that got hit in the head with a brick. Kant would say the reason we disapprove of that behavior is because he intended to do ill to someone. It's the intention that he had. Now let's go to an alternative situation. We have the same workman on a roof, and he accidentally, in the process of work, knocks a brick loose without intending it, without looking down and without knowing what's going on the ground. The brick falls and kills someone. In Hume's view, well, since it wasn't in Hume's view, it's pretty much the same action. He may be inclined to say, well, if it wasn't intended, I don't have as great a disapproval of it as I would if the person was being malicious, but still, I have a certain dislike of that because it makes me again feel bad. I have sympathy for the person that was hurt. In Kant's view, the man's action is morally blameless. He didn't intend to hurt anyone. He performed what we call an accident. Right? That's the distinction between intentionality and accidental behavior. And we have this idea built right into our legal system. There's not just murder, but intent to commit murder, conspiracy to commit murder. If a man was working on this roof and threw the brick down intentionally, we'd put him in jail. If he accidentally knocked the brick off, we would say it was an accident. We wouldn't hold it against him. We wouldn't say that he was morally blameworthy. We might say that he ought to be more careful in the future, that he ought to be more provident, but we wouldn't say that that was a morally evil disposition. That's the key distinction between Kant and Hume. Kant is concerned primarily with people's intentions, with the state of their soul, essentially.